All right, continuing on with our 2023 FRC Scouting App tutorial. Let's go ahead and get heavy into graphs and calculations today. So let's click on Graphs and click Manage. We're going to be creating 4 graphs today that I think are generally a good way to get a really quick look into how good a team has been doing during a competition. So let's start first by clicking on Add a new graph, and let's make a new horizontal bar graph. And this graph is going to be our average total score graph. So this is just going to give us a quick look into who has the best average total score during a competition. So to do this, let's go ahead and grab our team number and put that on the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, we're going to go ahead and grab total score. Or my bad, we want average total score. All right, there we go. You're going to see a bunch of average total scores. First, we should probably go ahead and sort by average total score. So now at the bottom, we have the least scoring, and at the top, we have the highest scoring. And then we should also go ahead and click on test data. And right now, it's only testing 10 of the teams we put in data for. I can go ahead and I could put this up to 200. For now, I'm going to put it around 70. All right, there we go. So we've got a few different teams in here. We've got their average scores. This, again, is just a really quick way to get a look at who is the best scoring robot at the competition that I'm at. You can do a whole bunch of other styling if you'd like, but generally I'm going to leave it there. The only thing I will do is change the Y center and the X center for these numbers. Okay, cool. Let's move on to our next graph, which will help us get a little bit more detail into total scores for teams. So this one's going to be a line graph that's going to help us track scoring over the matches during a competition. So did a team have one match that was really good? Are they trending upward? Are they trending downward, etc.? So let's click OK, and in our x-axis, since we're looking per match, we need to put the match number. Then on our y-axis, since we're looking at a per match basis, we're not going to use average total score, but rather total score for that one match. And here we go. So we've got something going here, but you'll notice that we've got 2 match ones. And that's because this line graph is showing every team's every match. So it's got multiple X's for the first match, that this is probably one team, maybe 33, and this is another team, maybe 40, 28. So in order to make sure that doesn't happen, we actually want a line for each robot or each team number. So the way to do that is really simple. We just look at this line area over here, and we need to drop in team number, and it'll make a line for each team number. There we go. Now you'll notice there are a lot of dots on here, not many lines. That's because a lot of the fake data I put in only had one match for each team. So you'll notice that each one of these guys only had one match, but 33 had 2 matches, and we actually get a line off of that. If we go back to test data, we'll notice we're actually only looking at 10 data points right now. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If we want to see more and probably get more lines, we can put this up. And here we go. So you'll notice I actually put in a few different matches for 4 separate teams. Those teams being 862, 33, 2609, 4028, and I believe that's it. So if you're paying really close attention, you'll notice 2 things. One, we've got a 20 down here for our minimum on the y-axis. That's not great because that kind of gives you a false sense of how much better one score is than another. So we should go ahead and go to our our axis settings, go to our y-axis settings, and make our custom minimum 0. Fits a little bit better, and it's going to be less misleading now. The second thing you might notice if you're paying really close attention is that all of these teams were in the same competition except for 2609. 2609 is actually in a completely different competition. And this brings me to another point. When we did our calculations earlier, we grouped by robot or team number, but we didn't group by competition, which means if you have one team that went to multiple competitions, you're going to see multiple ones show up for their team in one line rather than in separate lines. So what we want to do to fix this is go to calculations, and we're going to go back to our robot tab where we have team numbers are grouped by. We're going to go ahead and add the comp code. You can also go ahead and add comp name. I prefer to use comp code because it's a little shorter. So now we'll calculate the average of all these different things in here based on not only the team number, but the competition they were at, which I personally think is a good way to track this stuff because robots tend to change a lot from competition to competition. If you're not nearly as inclined to believe that, feel free to get rid of comp codes and continue to just look at team number averages, percents, etc. All right, so going back to our graphs, click the back button up here. So we need to just give this graph a name and we should generally be good. So I'll go graph settings and say score over time. So this is our score over time graph. And just before we move on, if you caught it, you might have noticed that the numbers at the bottom here are out of order. That's because right now they're actually in order of the time that they were put in the database. We can fix this pretty easily by going to graph sorting and make sure we sort based on match number. And there you go. Now it's all fixed. We've got our total score over time graph and we're good. So let's move on. So the next ones that we're going to do are going to be looking at score spreads. So that way you get an idea of why a team is strong and what they score the most. So let's start by looking at auto versus teleop. So is a team good in auto versus teleop? I'm going to use a pie chart for these next two, okay? So let's click on the simple pie chart. And let's start by grabbing the total score, average total score. So average auto score and average teleop score. Now, you'll notice that there are a whole bunch that are coming up here. This pie chart is actually trying to show us every team's individual auto score and average teleop score. So there are a couple cool things that you can do here to start actually looking at some of the team data. For one, we could go and just deal with this and we can see every team's separate one at the same time. The other thing we could do is go ahead and grab the team number and put it into the constraints down here. So we're going to constrain the team number that we're looking at on this graph. We can do two things. We can do it as a constant. So anytime someone uses this graph, they only see the one team number we put in, or we could have them select it. I'll show both here really quick. So if I do a constant and I put, let's say, team 33, you'll notice that we get a pretty simple graph. It's got a high value for teleop, so they're scoring about 61.5% of their points in teleop, and then they're scoring 38.5% of their points in auto. So that's pretty nice. Anytime I see this graph, I'll now just see team 33. Now the other thing that I could do is I could do user selection. Now there's a bunch of options here. I only want you to focus on type by user or selected from database. I'm going to use selected from database here. We're going to go to graph settings to check this out because when we did constant, it showed up here, but user select is what people who are using your scouting system will be able to see. And the way that you can see what that looks like is we click on graph settings and click preview graph. You'll see it come up and it says select values to see graph. Got it? I open it up here. I see all the data that's in my database. I'll go ahead and select 33 and there we go. And now I've got a graph I can play around with and look at the values for. And of course, I can select other teams as well. It's actually pretty interesting. We'll notice that 40, 28, and 33 both had a similar spread of teleop to auto score. Okay, pretty cool. So let's go ahead and name this one the scoring spread. All right, one more graph to go. So let's go back to graph manage and let's make another pie graph. So this is going to show us the spread of how people are scoring items. Maybe you want to know if another team is going to compliment you well. Do they score high? Do they score mid? Do they score low? And how much of that do they score? So let's click OK. And let's do something very similar to what we just did. But instead of doing the average teleop score or anything like that, we're actually going to use their teleop high, mid, and low items. So you're going to take teleop high, teleop mid, and teleop low. Now, before we used average teleop score, average auto score. Right now, we're not using the average teleop high items or mid items, but our graph can calculate it for us actually. So if we go to data aggregation on the side here and we click average, it will aggregate all of the teleop high items, mid, and low items into, well, just three numbers, one for high, one for mid, and one for low. And this will show us that across all of our records, typically what happens is we have more high items than mid items and more mid items than low items. If we go to test data, by the way, we can put in more and see that it's actually a slightly different spread, way more low than there are anything else. We can do what we did with our last pie graph as well. Again, right now, this is showing us every team that's in our database, but we might want to constrain that. So for instance, I will go ahead and do what we did last time, put in team number to the constraints, click this button, and click user select, selected from database. Now, again, if we go preview the graph, it'll ask me to put in the values. I'll select team 33, and I'll see that they score no low items, they're all mid, and they're all high. So now I've got a really good general understanding of how 33 does their scoring. I know that they get most of their points in teleop. I know that's probably because they do a lot of high items. That is really cool. So at a glance, we've got 4 graphs now that give us a really good idea of how a team is looking. Now there's one more graph that I'm going to add in as a bonus at the end here. Run with me for a sec. Let's go make a new graph and let's make a histogram. This graph is going to show us the frequency of cycle times. Now, what does that mean? Well, let me go ahead and show you. So let's go to our calculated fields, and you'll remember we at one point calculated the average match cycle time. So given a match, what was the average cycle time that was gotten in that match? And I'm going to go ahead and grab that and put that into the values on the histogram. Now, what this is showing me, let me actually go to test data, add more data here. What this is showing me is how often each one of the numbers down here comes up in the database within a certain range. So here you'll see that in the middle of the range is 0.77 seconds, and numbers around 0.77 seconds come up 6 times in our data set. And then likewise 1.19 comes up around 2, and then 2 seconds around 4. So what does this mean? Well, this means for the entire competition and every robot, I can know generally what the spread is of cycle times, which lets me know that in this case, most cycle times are pretty small, and then big ones, 4-second ones, are far less common. And I can constrain this just like I did the last few graphs, adding in a specific team, which would allow me to see how frequent a certain team gets certain cycle times, which would let me know whether or not they are very consistent, whether or not they have a huge spread, and I can't rely on them to always get a good cycle time. So with these 5 graphs, I think this gives us a really good idea of what a team is just at a quick glance, and this is going to let us do a whole lot of cool stuff once we get to dashboards in the next video.